All right, let's jump right in. Today, we're taking a radically different approach to our clinical case studies. We're actually going way back to antiquity to explore the Greek myth of Aphrodite and the Wanderer. Now, as psychology students, you're used to modern frameworks, but we are going to treat this incredibly vivid, almost graphic novel style fable as a profound therapeutic intervention. It's essentially a masterclass on the absolute necessity of ego death. So, within our clinical framework, we really have to reframe how we see the trickster archetype. It is absolutely not a villain. Think of it through that ancient Greek concept of the pharmakon, right? Something that is simultaneously a poison and a cure. It acts as this divine medicine. It bridges the sovereign allure and the deep shadow, functioning as this honeyed trap designed specifically to rescue the patient from the suffocating prison of their own ego. It subverts human dignity, sure, but purely to expose our carefully constructed illusions of order and logic. To really set the scene here, I want you to imagine our protagonist, the Wanderer, as a modern client walking right into your clinic. They're locked in this ego-driven need for absolute control, totally consumed by a feverish ambition to achieve what we can call sterile perfection. Suddenly, they stumble into the gilded glade. The air grows incredibly thick with this heavy pollen that literally chokes the lungs, and they are hit with the intoxicating scent of wild roses. This right here is the irresistible energy of the sovereign allure making its very first contact. Now, Aphrodite doesn't show up as some gentle, comforting guide trying to ease their anxiety. Not at all. She demands absolute submission. With a wholly disruptive spark flashing in her eyes, she steps in to test the wild, irrational beast that's sleeping right beneath our wanderer's starched robes of intellect. And she does this by offering 4 paths, which are essentially 4 profound psychological tests. Let's look at the first one, dismantling the Stoic shield. So here is the core conflict in what's known as the path of the silent shield. Aphrodite tells a story of a Stoic philosopher seeking apatheia, claiming to be this impenetrable fortress of logic, totally immune to Eros. But the reality? That fortress is nothing but a fragile paper shield. The guy is sent stuttering into the mud by a single flower petal. It perfectly illustrates that, when stacked up against the radiant, laughing reality of our messy human desire, strict Stoic logic is actually fundamentally irrational. Which leads us directly into our second test, cracking the illusion of order. We call this the path of the perfect line. First, Aphrodite leads the wanderer to a grove growing in absolute mathematical symmetry. She describes a grand festival playing music that is totally sterile and utterly devoid of life. Then, she subtly untunes a silver string, injecting a raw, sensual note into the mix. She's testing the client here. Is their ego brave enough to embrace living chaos? Can they accept the playful, disruptive cracks where true beauty actually breaks through? For the third test, the path of the golden mantle, Aphrodite presents this shimmering, invisible cloak of woven desire. She recounts the classic tale of a monarch completely blinded by his own classical hubris, who marches naked through his city. The takeaway for your practice: worldly authority is often just a fragile ego complex. It's an illusion that is easily stripped away by the simple, naked truth of our shared human absurdity. Moving on to the final test, the shadow of raw appetite. Here, the wanderer is handed a glittering golden apple. This forces its choice dictated by ancient philosophy. Will they choose logos, their higher reason, or epithumia, which is the raw, unthinking appetite of the shadow? It is the easy path of obsessive gratification. And the clinical warning she gives is incredibly stark. If you isolate your hunger from justice and yield only to the shadow, your grand architecture of ambition is just going to burn to ash. And that hesitation brings us to the climax, the fire of ego death. As the wanderer hesitates, the goddess's laughter echoes through the trees. But it's no longer a sweet melody. It's got this sharp, piercing edge. Imagine her voice hitting the client like a raging, violent river, completely tearing away all their hypocritical masks of modesty. She calls out their cowardly, shivering soul, looks right at that fragile ego and declares, "Safe love is a corpse, and I only deal in fire." She just outright mocks the client's desire for a tidy, safe, heroic journey, bound by their little domestic laws. She points out how utterly absurd it is that humans take themselves so terribly seriously, building these massive walls of stone and logic just to cage the wind. This isn't a gentle trial. This is a violent, absolutely necessary catharsis. It's an ego death that shatters a decade of carefully constructed treaties with a single, searing glance from the sovereign of their hidden hearts. Now let's look at the resolution. Laughter as divine medicine. You can see how flawlessly this mythic fable maps directly to clinical practice. The trickster archetype is a tool to systematically dismantle rigid perfectionism. The philosopher's stumble breaks down intellectualization. The discordant chord forces the acceptance of those disruptive cracks. The king's wardrobe exposes our profound human vulnerability. And the golden apple? That converts toxic obsession into joyful shadow integration. The divine medicine here is finally realizing that mischief isn't a sin. Actually, it's the exact oxygen that prevents the soul from suffocating under its own dignity. Laughter becomes the ultimate acceptance of the shadow. It's acknowledging that we are beautifully, spectacularly flawed creatures. As future therapists, your goal is to help the client surrender to the dance of existence, reaching a state of peace where they can just smile when the wind blows their carefully arranged papers right into the sea. This is the ultimate breakthrough. When the client stops fighting the jest and actually learns to laugh at their own undoing, the sheer terror of that dark shadow turns into a wild, breathless game of self-acceptance. They stop hiding behind a fragile paper shield, and they are finally, as the myth beautifully puts it, walking hand in hand with the gods. So I want to leave you with this final thought for your own journeys, both in the clinic and in life. When you are sitting across from a client who is suffocating inside the prison of their own ego, how are you going to invite this wholly disruptive spark into the room? How will you use the energy of the divine trickster to treat the fatal sickness of taking oneself too seriously? It's definitely something to think about. See you next time.